So securing $1 trillion, obviously a little bit of a attention grabber. There isn't $1 trillion of Bitcoin today yet, although it's getting closer. And so I want to talk about what it's going to look like in terms of securing it. If you don't know who I am, Mike Belshey. I'm a long-time technologist here in Silicon Valley. Been doing startups a long time. Got excited about Bitcoin 2012 or so. Been working on custody and secure wallets since 2013. I think helped push a little bit of the multi-sig that's in use hopefully today. Done a few other things. As for BitGo, we're about 100 people, mostly based out of Palo Alto now. We do about 15% of the world's transactions on Bitcoin, on-chain transactions, that is. That's all we do is on-chain transactions. And so that's grown pretty well. We support about 100 coins or so. Our clients are mostly institutional focused, which may be a little different from this room, but happy to answer some questions about that. And then I think it's interesting that with Bitcoin, the great thing about digital assets, you can hold it yourself, right? You don't have to rely on these banks, these terrible guys have been ripping us off for years. But at the same time, other people need that. So let's talk about that. All right, so security is a feature you never finish. It's kind of a sad point for a developer, but it's also kind of fun. We get to keep working on it. Basically, the security that you apply to any problem is going to be proportional to the value of what's secured. So for instance, if you had a piggy bank on your daughter's desk and it was full of quarters today, you might not spend much time securing it. But if those quarters turned into $10,000 bills, you would obviously try to do something different. So this is the same problem that we have in digital assets because the value of these assets is growing tremendously. Just to put it into real numbers, at BitGo ourselves, we've witnessed this. 2013, wallets were pretty small. They got a little bigger, 2015, 2017. Today, if we're not planning for the $1 trillion wallet right now, it's going to catch us off guard. This is not easy stuff to build. Security is very hard. We read about all too many tragedies pretty much every day. So that's why we're working on this. All right, so the dilemma is this. When we think about security, we tend to think about what's our risk today? I got $1 million worth of Bitcoin. Does that make you uncomfortable? Does it make you, maybe you're not uncomfortable. If that turns into $1 billion, at what point do you get uncomfortable? And I think when you look at that risk tomorrow, it's hard to plan for tomorrow's risk when we're so much caught up today. So, hey, why worry about this stuff though, right? Isn't this supposed to be decentralized? Everybody holds their own wallets, et cetera, et cetera. Two big use cases that are happening right now. First off, if you're a fiduciary, and you're trying to run a fund, if you're trying to hold an ETF or whatever it is you're trying to do, you have responsibilities that are very different than an individual would when it comes to storing Bitcoin. Your own personal reputation's at risk, as well as, of course, legal, ethical issues. You have to do a different job. At BitGo, we would like to see digital assets usable by everybody on the planet. And I know when you survey users out there, there's a lot of people that are uncomfortable holding private keys or understanding this technology today, but they would like to be able to participate. So they're looking for somebody to help, and that's where these fiduciaries come in. So we've really focused on that. Of course, our business being naturally aimed towards those that are holding larger amounts of asset has kind of self-targeted towards those people. The second thing is actually more recent, though. There's a lot of fear out there. I don't want to be a creator of fear. I don't think physical risk today is that much of a problem for holders of Bitcoin. There have been incidents. It's a problem. It's probably going to get worse, though. But the fear is kind of running ahead of the actual realities of that risk. We have had a lot of people come to us. These have been longtime holders of Bitcoin that previously were comfortable actually holding assets on their own, and now they no longer are. They're starting to worry about when they travel, what's going to happen to them. They're known holders of Bitcoin. They don't want to have that type of exposure. By the way, public service announcement, you can get me. I have no Bitcoin on me. You can't cut my finger off. I won't be able to give it to you, et cetera. By the way, we had a security consultant come in. He was an ex-government guy, and he says, in a very curmudgeon type of way, he says, look, all security comes down to fingers and kids. And it's true. At the end of the day, people threatened to have their fingers cut off or people threatened for the lives of their children will give up anything to that attacker. So it's really imperative that we build additional protocols to secure this stuff. All right. Sadly, in spite of all the things you read, we have a hack on an exchange pretty much every month, and that happened all last year, and it'll happen all this year, because we haven't gotten our act together. But on the grand scheme of things, today's attackers are absolute amateurs. Just like any burglar, they'll go in through an easy window, rather than trying to knock down a solid door, right? And frankly, we've got too many windows open in crypto today. We've got sloppy operational practices. We don't really know how to secure our accounts against takeovers. We do know security best practices, but some of the places where we expect to get help, things like Google, not being able to get your Gmail compromised by a backdoor backup key that they'll expose just on an SMS text message because you hooked up your phone. These things exist. We haven't actually had to secure data before as a society, and we are failing left, right, and center. So the problem is, when you start to think about $1 trillion, the attacks are going to get extremely serious. Suddenly, organized crime, which is already getting into Bitcoin, has a lot more profitability to be had by trying to take these coins. So the coordinated phishing and con scams are going to get bigger. However deep, however paranoid you might be, you can't be paranoid enough. We've gotten called in all too often after somebody's lost assets. The depth of the con scams is deep, and it's going to get deeper. They will get into your friends. They will get into your family's accounts. They will get into your children's accounts. They will come after with a highly targeted campaign, and as a human, they will try to get you. So anyway, I think we're at the beginning, at the forefront. Sorry to sound so scary, but it is where it is. All right, so how do you secure $1 trillion? This should be quick. All right, so quick review. I guess I took some of these slides from a previous deck and kind of condensed it. But some of the things that you have to worry about, of course, hacking. All right, that's a large bucket. Malware is something we're all worried about. It happens all the time. Insider theft is a big deal once you start talking to a custodian like BitGo. How do you know a custodian isn't going to have people that are paid very little to process customer support tickets and aren't going to steal from you? What happens when you die? That's increasingly becoming a concern for clients. Data loss, it seems so easy. Just keep a backup, put it somewhere, but it's hard. Keeping that backup secure is harder. Forgotten passwords, et cetera, natural disasters. All right, so some things that don't work. And we feel pretty strongly about these at BitGo. Actually, the number one thing I would like to see, let's get to a place where safekeeping is actually working. We're not losing assets. You never wake up, log into your account, and see a big goose egg. All right, so moving money fast. Interestingly, the market structure that we have for crypto today is such that you have to move the money and pre-fund an exchange. No other asset class works this way, just Bitcoin. And as a result of that, people have to take money out of cold storage to get it pre-funded onto an exchange as quickly as possible. That is a very big compromise in security. It's a shame that today, as users of this asset class, you have to make a conscious decision. Do I want security or do I want liquidity? We have to fix this. It's a market structure problem. I didn't put it into these slides. There's a lot to be talked about on there. Mobile phones are actually a pretty big problem. There's still a lot of wallets that are based off of mobile phones. It's okay for small amounts of money that you're okay to lose. But frankly, these are things that if you defer your policy out to your users are not experts in security. All people will lose key material, full stop. So unfortunately, when you start using phones, even aggregates of phones, even when they're geotagged and they have to be in different places, it's all too easy to coordinate an attack around that. Biometrics is an absolute must-have, and yet you can't rely on it too much. It's not the be-all and end-all. It's not an actual key. It's not a signature. And don't assume people can do it. Hot storage, don't use it beyond what you can afford to lose. I'm a big believer in cold storage to this day, even though it is that horrible trade-off of having less liquidity. But if we build the market structure right, you ought to be able to trade straight out of your cold storage without having to compromise between the two. All right. So basically, security, just real quick, run through. It's eliminating single points of failure. This is what we do with any asset class, with anything that you're securing. So if you're dependent on a single key, you add more keys. Single person, add more people. You can go from 2 to 3 to 4. You can put them around the world. Single company. We're working with some clients where actually the regulators are excited about this, and I don't think it's ever happened before, where 2 companies can independently be involved on a transaction with separate hardware, separate software, separate operative personnel to help make sure that a transaction is actually legit. If you're in a single location, make sure you're in more geographies. Put those keys 1,000 miles apart, I would recommend. Some countries today, the legislators and regulators are having a real trouble here. Everybody likes the idea I should say all regulators like the idea that the keys belong within their jurisdiction. Okay, I understand why they think that as a regulator. I may not agree, but I understand what they're getting at. Challenge is, if you're Switzerland, you just don't have that much space. Monaco, you don't have much space, right? There's a lot of smaller countries that are actually trying to bring keys there to provide good jurisdiction, but unfortunately that creates a new set of problems. And I guarantee you they never think of that stuff. So operate in multiple jurisdictions. All right, so this is the quick summary version. I guess I'm jamming through these slides so I can go into some more detail. But I put in some categories here, right? So personnel actually is something that smaller companies generally don't think about, but actually deep background checks are pretty important. I don't know if any of you run companies and have done these, but personnel that are put in place to spy or collect information is very real. Software development lifecycle is something that we are terrible at securing. One of the wallets, as you know, probably, maybe you don't know, a couple years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, somebody in the audience knows, but we've had multiple supply chain attacks against the software that we're trying to build. We depend on a lot of open software these days, and we don't tend to have procedures and processes in place naturally to be able to audit the massive amounts of stuff that we build on top of. That is an extremely hard job. It requires a lot of personnel, and unfortunately, there's just no way around it. Keeping up with patches and making sure that you're not inserting something that was designed to hurt you is a very large task. Technology. Actually, the technology of all the things that people ask BitGo about, in some ways, is the least. And the reason is because clients are getting pitched all the time by this new technology, threshold signatures, or multi-party computation, or multi-sig this, or whatever it is. And unfortunately, the people that are trying to evaluate whether that's good technology or not, they don't have the depth or the ability to actually do that diligence that would be required to determine which one's the best. So they end up relying on other factors. They end up relying on what kind of audits do you have in place, how long you've been in operation, who's on your board, things like that. All right. Operational. You can have a fantastic technology, but if you take that great password and you write it down and stick it on your monitor, it doesn't work that well. And this is a real problem. There's a lot of really fantastic technology coming out, but the operational side of it is at least as important, if not more important. And finally, regulatory security is an issue if you're looking to have someone else hold your assets. Probably most people don't understand the legal distinction, but when you give your money to an exchange, you're actually just taking an IOU from that exchange, and if that exchange has a failure of any kind, your assets, whatever was there, gets wrapped up in the list of credits that go into bankruptcy court. So you'll be in line behind all of the other creditors, and that's it. When you use a bank, you use a trust company, you have your own account. And if that bank or trust company goes under, there's a regulator that will come in, your funds are yours, they don't get wrapped up in bankruptcy. All right. So lastly, must be global. And here I guess I want to talk a little bit about where we see things going. The local solutions aren't going to work. We're going to need to have a global solution. So many vaults, globally distributed, to cover that jurisdictional risk, I think is one of the big problems we have to get to trillion-dollar wallet sizes. Unfortunately, the regulators are a little bit unwieldy, but on top of that, the location being within a single nation is a great threat. So we really need to split that apart. That means we need to have a global network of vaults, both cold storage and some could be co-signing or auto vaults, but it needs to be a combination of all those things. And then on top of that, I believe multi-sig, self-serving a little bit there, but absolutely need that, and a strong policy risk management inside of HSMs. Sadly, the state of HSMs, HSMs are hardware security modules, is not very good. Although these have been used and in practice with many banks for decades, they've kind of fallen behind. And the number of attack vectors against Gemalto and others has been staggeringly large. Part of the problem is actually not having open source software. It hasn't been audited very well, but they haven't kept up with patches, and just basic things that were fixed long ago in other systems have not been fixed in HSM. So we're actually having to rebuild HSMs from scratch and get that all reviewed. That takes a long time. The SOC audits is one last thing I want to mention about how you secure things. And to technologists, audits don't sound very satisfying, and they shouldn't. But when it comes to operating in a business level 24/7, you have to be able to verify that the operating procedures are in place and that they're followed. There's been repeated hacks where Unfortunately, operations get sloppy, a password is kept somewhere, someone who left the company still has access to partial key material. All of these things end up being breadcrumbs for the attacker to come in later and infiltrate and steal. These audits do work to some degree, but they're not good enough. You need SOC, you need ISO, you need additional audits, particularly around the crypto handling, because it is a new type of asset class, and we're just not very good at it. All right, so one last thing about how would you secure $1 trillion? I mean, banks have been handling large amounts of money. How do they secure it? I can't ask you guys questions, so it's rhetorical. All right, they don't. Of course, banks don't secure it. Actually, what they do, if you give a bank $1 trillion, they're going to chop that $1 trillion into like $1 million loans. And then instead of trying to secure the actual asset, they have the responsibility of bringing all the loans back home. So they have a new problem. They have to manage the risk of that. But actually, it is a form of decentralization when you think about it. And as we get to that $1 trillion size, we do have to think about, like, do we want to have stockpiles of digital assets, just like stockpiles of gold inside of Fort Knox, all in one place of that size? Whether $1 trillion isn't appealing enough to you, maybe it's 10 trillion, but at some value, you've got to admit that nation states coming in with military to come and try to take the funds is quite real. And even if you distribute all of the vaults and everything else, there's a lot of problems with making that happen against that sized attacker. So 100% reserve is something that I think Bitcoiners generally hold near and dear to our hearts. We like it because we know that the guy that's holding the funds on our behalf isn't taking risks that they're not being transparent with us about. However, you have to recognize that putting all of the money into large piles is also a risk. And so how do we balance those two? Transparency, blockchains, making sure that people can see exactly where their assets are, full disclosure, things like that, are a big part of security. We'll then be able to start using lending in some way that everyone should know exactly what's going on. But it's interesting to think about, how do banks secure it today? They actually don't. They federate it out. They do make a decentralized system. It's not very good. It's completely not transparent. They nickel and dime you all along the way, but that's what they do. So anyway, that's all I got. Thank you.